What's up, everyone? I'm proud of you for showing up today. Welcome to week 2 of Trauma to Triumph training by yours truly. If you were here last week, you know that we discussed the statistics that prove a need for trauma informed care in our communities. This week, we will discuss what trauma is and how it shows up in many different forms. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Kalia, and I decided to make trauma informed care normal by posting these videos every week so everyone in the community can have access to the tools to help us better serve our youth. A little background about me: I grew up in the foster care system. My mother was an addict, my father wasn't present, and my untreated trauma went on to affect me in major ways. I fell to addiction, I ended up incarcerated, homeless, and I even made attempts on my own life. Once I got sober, which I have been for 4 years now, I decided that I wanted to be a part of the change. I wanted to be somebody who made an impact in the communities that didn't have the resources to better serve me as a child. So I created this training so the adults in our communities could better serve the youth. So let's get into it. Trauma to Triumph by yours truly. What is trauma? Trauma is a response to an event or a series of events that is deeply disturbing or harmful. Trauma can come in many forms, and every individual may respond differently. For children in foster care, trauma often includes physical or emotional abuse, including sexual abuse, neglect, abandonment, loss of the biological family, witnessing violence, and exposure to untreated addictions. And that applies to children not in foster care, right? I experienced abuse in the foster care system and outside of the foster care system. And every child views trauma differently. Some people don't realize that they experience trauma until they're in their late adolescent or adulthood and it starts to resurface. Because when someone experiences trauma, a lot of the times they suppress those memories in order to avoid feeling those uncomfortable emotions. Types of trauma. Acute trauma occurs from a single distressing event. For an example, an accident or a loss of a parent. I lost my mother when I was 16. Obviously, I experienced a lot of trauma before then, but that is an example of a trauma that I suppressed and I didn't deal with until I was late into my 20s. Chronic trauma results from repeated or prolonged exposure to distressing events, like ongoing neglect or abuse. So this is something that happens over a period of time. Children who are constantly exposed to abuse, constantly exposed to neglect, parents bouncing in and out of their lives. And then there's complex trauma, which refers to the exposure to multiple and often traumatic events over a period of time, often from multiple sources. So if you live in a violent home and then you go to the foster care system and you experience abuse there, this is when the child experiences multiple different forms of trauma combined, and it can happen in multiple different scenarios. Common causes of trauma. Common trauma responses. Flight, fight, or freeze. I think a lot of us are familiar with flight, fight, or freeze. Even as adults, we all exhibit this when we're met with any type of uncomfortable circumstance. So these are the automatic responses to danger that is wired within all of us. Children may act out aggressively, fight, run away, flight, or shut down, isolate, and freeze, which is super common. So be mindful of that. If a kid is acting out and they're being more aggressive than normal, it might not be because this kid is just naturally aggressive or bad or an angry kid. They might be having a direct response to trauma that they're experiencing, and they're unfamiliar with how to express that in any other way. I find that especially kids who are physically abused, when you're exposed to violence like that, it teaches you that that behavior is acceptable. Also, run, flight. Kids will run away or isolate because it's easier to just get out of the circumstance and not be seen, because that's been taught that that's safe for them. So just be mindful of how these different things might show up when experiencing a child with trauma. Emotional distress, feelings of sadness, fear, anger, anxiety, or numbness. Ooh, numbness is one of my number one emotions that I experienced as I navigated my trauma. I kind of shut down. I remember after my mom died, people saying, Clea, your mom just passed away. Are you okay? What's going on? You haven't expressed it at all. But because I had experienced so much trauma leading up to this event, I was numb to the bad things that were happening in my life. It had become so normalized that it was easier just not to feel at all. But sadness, fear, anger, anxiety. Sometimes kids don't want to go to school or they don't want to go home because that is where the danger lies. Be present enough to notice when a kid's emotion is off. Understanding a child's baseline is the key to knowing when their emotions are fluctuating in a way that's abnormal for that particular individual. Cognitive impairment, which is difficulty focusing, remembering, or processing their emotions. Like I said earlier, a lot of kids will suppress memories so they won't remember or they won't be able to process. Some kids may lose their cognitive focus. They won't be able to pay attention in schools, and that affects them academically. So just be mindful that is another way that trauma can show up in the youth. The impact of trauma on brain development. Trauma can affect a child's brain development, particularly in areas responsible for emotional regulation, learning, and memory. Over time, children who experience trauma may struggle with emotional responses, forming healthy relationships, or trusting others. Untreated, this can lead to chronic illness, addiction, mental health issues, suicide, incarceration, and more. So the long-term effects of trauma are so damaging if it goes untreated. As you see, chronic illness, addiction, mental health issues, suicide, incarceration, and more. And I experienced all of those things in my adult life and in my adolescence life. My first attempt on my life, I was only 12 years old. Imagine a 12-year-old feeling like they had no other option, like there was no place for them in this world because the things that they were experiencing in the household were so damning. And chronic illnesses, children who experience trauma are 30% more likely to pass away from a chronic illness because trauma lives in the body. When you're constant fight or flight state, you don't ever allow your mind, your body to rest. So it affects you in a horrible, horrible way. So that's why it's so important that the people around us, the people who are dealing with the youth, are knowledgeable on how to recognize trauma so they can support these kids and help them get the proper treatment necessary so they don't live with this trauma inside of them until they're in their late 20s and 30s like I did. I think that everybody here today should give yourself some credit for showing up and understand that trauma doesn't just go away. It takes a village, it takes a community because it deeply affects the child. There's a book called The Body Takes Score, and we'll talk about that a little later in the training. But if you haven't already got a copy of it, I suggest that you read it. It breaks down how trauma lives in the being. 1 in 4 children will experience some form of trauma before they graduate high school. That means if you're in a group of 4 of your friends, as adults, 1 in 4 of you have experienced some form of trauma, and that is just those who have reported it. So we're gonna wrap it up for today. I don't wanna bore you guys. I wanna make each section palatable so you guys can receive the information, sit with it, ask any questions, and then next week we will be talking about building trust with children impacted by trauma, which is a key component to helping them get the proper support that they need. Thank you for showing up today, and remember, you matter. What you do matters. How you show up matters. And as adults in the community, we have a responsibility to serve the youth to the best of our capability. And you're doing that by showing up today. Thank you guys. I love you.